Having grown up in the military, packing up and moving every few years is one of my earliest memories. Our move to Illinois, though, the year I started third grade, wasn't like any of the others. My mother didn't stand in the rooms where the moving company was, ensuring that her china was packed just so, that the teak tables and chairs remained unscratched, that her piano was moved gently. And our things, she didn't hear my stories about my stuffed animals and my dolls and my books, the explanations for why they most certainly needed to make the trip north. Instead, without thought or selection, without narrative, history, or biography of any sort, everything from my drawers and closets and surfaces in my room was unceremoniously picked up and dumped into boxes, which, when filled, were sealed closed, headed for burial in a moving truck. One box left me deeply troubled, the woman from the moving company's fleshy arms hurling more than holding my treasures into the cold darkness of a box, and while popping a cigarette into her mouth and casting about for what must have been her lighter, sealed the box, got up with a harumph, and left the room. She didn't like her job, I thought. And then it hit me. Squee. Oh no. I dashed about the room looking for my favorite stuffed animal, Squee the mouse. Squee had been my companion from a very early age, and since my mother had died just a few months before, he had come back into my life as a great comfort. But Squee was not on my bed, he was not under it, not anywhere to be found. Squee was in the box. I was terrified for him. "You okay, honey?" the moving lady said when she came back in. But I couldn't speak. I sat down with my back to the box, legs curled into the hug of my arms. Before dinner, my dad helped me unseal the box and dig through it until we found him, Squee. A book had been pressing into his snout and left a triangular imprint, so I gave him some extra love there. Many weeks later, after a long drive north in our convertible Volkswagen Bug, the moving truck arrived at our new quarters, and we began unpacking. In one of the boxes marked "the girls' room," I unearthed a jar with coins in it and a note in it. "I owe you," the note said. "On June 1st, 1973, I owe Mary Carter Green $2.35 and will pay 1 dime every day after June 10th, if not paid by then. Signed, Alan Green." Wait a minute. I had hit the jackpot. This was January, and my brother still had not paid back his debt. He was more than 200 days overdue. That buried promise had made me rich. "Joy and woe are woven fine," William Blake wrote. It is right and should be so. Man was made for joy and woe. And when this we rightly know, through the world we safely go. Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. I couldn't have been happier, but there was much weeping and gnashing of teeth when I brought the credit slip to my big brother. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Matthew's parable is most often read one of two ways, each as contradictory to the other as the story of my young self, able to love so fiercely I would move the world for a stuffed animal, and equally able to extort my only brother of his last dime if it were owed me. Although sometimes read this way, Matthew's story does not point to a kingdom where some are denied because they fail to go along. The story draws attention to an unjust system. The parable would have been heard in its day as a description of the times when peasants were extorted for their land, and it would be taken by those who already held the concentrated wealth of the area and influence. The parable reflects how early followers of Jesus struggled in difficult times to know how to best wait for his return and how to live in the meantime. Should they play into the social demands or do the dirty work of the system? Should they live radically in a completely different way that might realize the kingdom Jesus described in Matthew? An act of subversion and resistance, those who heard Matthew's gospel were then and are now called and invited to consider the same. Unjust social systems, accumulation of wealth by the few, and greed of the many, as described in the parable, persist to this day, of course. Andy Knox, in his Reimagining the Future blog, retells the parable for our global economy in this way. For it will be like the CEO of a big chocolate company who went to a country far away to ensure a good flow of chocolate and ever expand his chocolate empire. He called 3 of his most entrusted leaders to himself and asked them to ensure more chocolate at a lower price. The first 2 knew if they did well, they would secure their own future in the company and a good income for their families. They came up with a cunning plan. They decided the best way would be to get cheap labor or even free labor. So they enslaved children from the surrounding area, put them to work in the fields picking cocoa or at the grinding machines under terrible conditions, in which many of the children were abused by hard taskmasters. The third manager saw what the other 2 were up to, and he refused to enslave children and couldn't understand the motivation of the CEO. He chose to pay people a fair wage, keep their working conditions good, and have strong morale amongst his team. The CEO returned, full of praise for the business acumen of the first 2. He paid them well, thus ensuring his fair trade logo, and set them up for even more. The third guy, our hero, was sacked from the company with no right of appeal, confused and dismayed. He continued to try to live a life that restored people's humanity and hoped for the more beautiful world our hearts tell us is possible. Andy Knox's retelling of the parable we just heard demonstrates how woe and joy are woven fine. It is hard to do the right thing in systems that demand and oppress at the worst, and enthrall and distract at the best, but it is possible. It can be hard to see supply chains like the one described in the parable of the chocolate magnate, but to act justly in a problematic system, we can consider our consumption in the first place and be intentional about how we spend our money. Now, as someone who loves shopping and obviously loves my possessions, I'll be the first to admit that making changes can feel overwhelming. But fortunately, there's support for this. A Nature article entitled "Scientists' Warning on Affluence" lays out a strong correlation between affluence and the growing climate crisis. But the research does not stop at gloom and doom. It offers steps to correct for our part in the system. For over half a century, the article says, worldwide growth in affluence has continuously increased resource use and pollutant emissions far more rapidly than these have been reduced through better technology. The affluent citizens of the world, the article continues, are responsible for most environmental impacts and are, and here's the parable at play, central to any future prospect of retreating to safer environmental conditions. The research-based article lays out some clear, if not easy, behavioral changes we can make in the U.S., including avoiding oversized, unnecessary, and duplicate goods and services, shifting from animal to plant-based food sources, sharing and repairing before replacing goods, and pushing for regulation that reflects concerns for people and the planet. These may be new habits, even countercultural to the clarion call for the new thing in the days leading up to Black Friday and my favorite shopping season of the year. But this is what our gospel teaches us. The kingdom of God will be brought by the courageous, even the radical. These sorts of changes are necessary and they are possible. This sort of faith brings us here today, and our shared communion unites us with God. Our shared commitment to stand up for God's creation and all of humanity and against systems that oppress, degrade, and injure means we do not have to be alone metaphorically in burying the talent. In the courageous presence of the church, still standing, still growing, still thriving, we respond to the crises of our time in community. We have never been a community to stand back and watch God's people get boxed up and sealed away from hope. And I know we will not allow God's creation to suffer that either. Have courage and meet our time. This is the message of our parable today. The third man in the parable does not sow despair by planting the talent. He seeds hope. Woe and joy are knit together. God is our source of this joy and the presence that will provide all that we need to meet the times. So this week, which we mark as In-Gathering Sunday, we give thanks for all who have pledged to support the cathedral financially and in its mission to the world. And we nudge those who are waiting to invest your talents, your time, and your treasure into this cathedral community. With courage, together, we are 100% grace.